Good afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Patrick Glass, and I am a graduate student at Purdue University's Homeland Security Institute. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the mission and vision of the Purdue Homeland Security Institute, what are some of the past projects we've done, and talk about some of our current research projects, and then what are we looking at in the future. Our mission basically is to grow interdisciplinary research and develop future leaders in the Homeland Security arena. The intent is to basically, we want to use technology to test policies and practices at the Homeland Security level, at the state and local and national level, and see where it goes. Some of our past research projects, we looked at City of Chicago catastrophic event planning. What would happen if a 15 kiloton nuclear detonation went off in downtown? We also looked at the 2012 Indianapolis Super Bowl. How can we better improve the security of that facility in Lucas Oil Stadium? And we also looked at pandemic flu preparations and what ways we can do to help reduce the risk. So the models we're going to look at today, we're going to look at the active shooter mitigation, both in educational facilities and in businesses. So, question is, what is an active shooter, right? The Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have a pretty good definition of what an active shooter is. An active shooter is basically an individual who is randomly picking out targets within a confined space, okay? Usually that means it's 4 or more victims per incident. They don't necessarily have to use firearms, but that's the most common. Why is this significant? Well, for obvious reasons. Over the past couple decades, they've become a lot more prevalent. They've gotten a lot more media attention. And if there's no action taken, if we don't come up with ways to mitigate them, they could get a lot worse. We use modeling as a way to safely and cost-efficiently test the policies and practices in order to help prevent things, catastrophic events in the future. So, how prevalent are these? Well, the FBI actually did a study to determine that. They looked at active shooter events from 2000 to 2013, basically being kicked off by the Columbine incident of 1999, and what they determined was during that time period, there were 160 active shooter events in the United States. That averaged to be at 11.4 per year. That number has actually increased from about 7 in 2000 up to about 14 in 2013, resulting in over 1,000 casualties and just under 500 deaths. Most of the active shooter events happen in commerce areas, businesses, and things like that. However, the media tends to focus more on the second most common thread, which is in educational facilities and schools. And the vast majority of these happen in places where firearms are restricted, otherwise known as gun-free zones. So how do we get the research data? How do we develop our model? We looked at, we started this project back in 2012, and we looked at what was the most recent, the most heavily looked at, and that would be schools. So we went back and looked at as many schools as we could find to gather data. The most common ones were Virginia Tech in 2007, Northern Illinois in 2008, Chardon High School in 2012, and of course Sandy Hook in 2012. What was the methodology we used? Well, we looked at 3 different situations: school shootings, small business shootings, or a large campus of multiple buildings of one business. And we went each of those situations through 4 different scenarios. First scenario being there's no access control, so anybody can walk in and out of the premises as needed, with or without an armed resource officer or an armed security guard. We also looked at what would happen if we allowed 5 to 10% of the employees to actively carry a concealed weapon. And then the final thing is, what if we looked at 5 to 10% of the employees with concealed carries, plus an additional resource officer who is armed and aware. First thing we'll look at is the school model. Okay, this is a generic school. It's not any particular school. And as you can see, there's classrooms to the bottom and to the side. There's large open areas that would resemble a gymnasium, or a cafeteria, hallways, administrative offices, and things of that nature. For the small business model, we're looking at a business with about 8 to 10 employees, again, with common areas, break rooms, offices, main entrance and exit for the employees and for anybody who's wishing to patronize this business. For the large campus model, we basically took the format for the small business and multiplied it into 4 different areas. This would simulate an organization or business that has between 100 to 150 employees that might be scattered over a larger area, not just confined to one building. Now, I'll talk about the model itself and what we actually looked at. If you'll notice the green dots, each of those are employees. They are assigned to a specific desk or a specific area. When they are healthy or not wounded, they are green. At the time we run the model, what happens is a black dot representing the active shooter comes in and randomly picks one of the 4 buildings that he's going to approach. Once the active shooter makes the decision of which building that he or she will go to, then the active shooter gets assigned another random room in which to go to. Once the active shooter gets to that room, every 20 seconds, he'll send out a message to anybody who's in the room. If they're within 25 meters, which is the average range of a small arms weapon, then that individual is considered to be wounded and they turn red. Right? Once that happens, that triggers the bottom set of logic there, which is the car that goes across the bottom of the screen. That symbolizes the dispatching and sending off of a law enforcement officer, which the average response time is about 10 minutes. So we simulate the 10-minute flow of the police officer to arrive. Once the police officer arrives, he will approach the active shooter. Once the police officer comes in contact with the active shooter, then that's when the simulation stops. So, how we design the model. We have over on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see we have places where you can input your own data if you wanted to test your own particular business or your own particular school. But if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, we also have 4 models that are already built in, representing Sandy Hook, West Virginia University, and a couple other shootings that have happened recently. Go ahead and show the video real quick, and you can kind of get an idea of how this model actually runs. And this is going to be a simulation of this Sandy Hook. There's the active shooter, comes in, randomly assigns. Once he hits a target, the target turns red. Once the active shooter has engaged all the targets, or as much as needed, then the active shooter then moves to another location, where he then starts assigning additional wounds. At the bottom, you'll notice the vehicle drove across the bottom of the screen, which simulated the response of the law enforcement. And then that's when the law enforcement approached the active shooter and the model ended. So what are the results? Looking at the school shootings, if we did absolutely nothing, had open doors where anybody could walk into the school, we had a pretty large, substantial number of casualties and at least a 10-minute response time for the law enforcement officer. When we include an armed resource officer, which could either be law enforcement officer or somebody assigned by the school to actively carry a weapon, those numbers drastically decreased, the number of casualties and the time of response to the active shooter. If we didn't have the active shooter, didn't have the resource officer, but we included 5% or 10% concealed carry of the faculty, what you'll notice is the response time is about the same, but the casualties are larger. And the reason for that is The teachers, the faculty with a concealed carry, we did not have them actively going after and seeking after the active shooter. They stayed in the spot, and once the active shooter got in vicinity, that's when it ended the model. Similar results for the small business. The difference here, the one other thing that we looked at with this, was what would happen if we simply locked the doors and did not allow the active shooter into the offices. Locking the doors does have a substantial difference. It increases the amount of time that individuals can respond to the active shooter, mainly because the shooter takes more time to get into the building or into the room, but it actually decreases the number of casualties. However, that being said, obviously most businesses don't want to keep their doors locked because they want to make accessible for customers and patrons. Similar results with the large campus analysis. The most significant decrease is going to be a 10% concealed carry by employees in addition to an armed resource officer. Now, one thing that we did not look at was what's the incidence of injuries happening from the concealed carry person? Okay, what's the risk? So how many times does the concealed carry person have an accidental discharge? How many times does the concealed carry person miss his or her target? Those are things that we weren't looking at. But again, we were looking at what are ways that we can help mitigate risk based off of policies and procedures of businesses and schools. Here are some of the combined results, very similar to what we've already seen. So they'll conclude about their active shooter. As stated, there's no single approach or policy that worked everywhere, okay? Armed security, having an armed security saves the most lives. However, not all businesses are allowed to have armed security. Not all businesses are comfortable with having armed security. So that's when we looked at other things such as keeping the doors locked, having the ability to lock doors, or having practice drills where employees and students or whatnot can go towards those secure areas and separate themselves from an active shooter. And then, of course, simulation, we use the simulation modeling as a way to test the particular policies or procedures that your business or your school want to investigate without having to put anybody in risk. Now I want to talk a little bit about modeling points of distribution, which is what my thesis research is on. A little bit of background. I know this is all gloom and gloom here, so I apologize for setting the mood down. But following September 11th attacks of 2001, Congress, certain members of Congress and the Senate did receive letters tainted with anthrax. The government saw a need. If this happens on a large scale, how can we reduce this threat? How can we mitigate it? They came up with the idea of maintaining large quantities of medication known as the National Strategic Stockpile and being able to distribute those to large populations within 72 hours. They do this through a method known as point of distribution sites. A little bit of information about the Strategic National Stockpile. It is managed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It is distributed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They're positioned all throughout the country. The intent is to be able to distribute medicines and prophylaxis to whoever needs it within 48 hours. So how is a pod distributed? Well, patients come into the pod. They first get triaged to determine if they're sick. If they are sick, they get moved off and sent to a clinic to be treated. Once they determine that they're not sick, they go through a serpentine where they can look at and fill out registration paperwork to determine what kind of medication is going to be best suited for them. They take that paperwork to the two screening stations where a registered nurse or a physician will then review it, go through an algorithm and determine these are the particular medications that we're looking at that we would like to give you. and then send those to a dispensing station in the back, where that dispensing station will then distribute the medication, vaccine, prophylaxis, whatever the screening station determined was best fit. What we were looking at is, how can we best optimize this to prevent as many backlogs as possible? We started off with taking simple random samples from other previous pod exercises and then putting them into the model, looking at the registration tables, screening and dispensing, plugging those times in. Then we would run an optimizer and look at, well, what is the number based off of the total population that we're looking to vaccinate, and plugging in the total number of volunteers that we have. After running the optimization, it would generate the results, and we would be able to test it. What we came up with based off of population, if we had 20,000, 15, or 10,000, these are the number of man-hours that we'd be able to save, overall saving a local community, a state, or the federal government 64% on basically all scenarios. Here's a quick little video to kind of describe what our what our point of distribution site looks like and how it's ran. Here you can see the patients are starting to come in. They'll eventually start walking up to the triage station where they'll actually get triaged to determine, are you sick? Are you not sick? Once they're finished with the triage station, they walk through the serpentine, where they go to registration stations, and that's when they begin to fill out paperwork. It usually takes between 1.5 to 2 minutes per person to fill out the paperwork. Once they fill out the paperwork, basically describing these are the allergies that I have, this is my previous medical background, so on and so forth, they'll move to the screening station. Here the screeners will then run through the algorithm, like I said earlier, and determine these are the medications that will best fit you for your particular need. They mark on the registration form. The patients take that registration form to the dispensing stations in the rear, where they get dispensed their medication and receive instructions on how to take the medication in the future, or if they have any additional medications for their families. So, conclusion of our pod exercise. We use the computer simulation to improve staffing allocations for the point of distribution sites, help reduce the number of staff, help improve efficiency, and also at the same time try and look at how can we reduce errors associated with this. So some of our research that we're looking at for the future, we're currently working with a professional sports arena to look at how can we improve their security, how can we help reduce the risk of active shooters in a large-scale model such as that. We're also looking at the Department of Homeland Security's active shooter response. They have a phrase out called run, hide, fight in the event of an active shooter. They have no data to back that up. They're just basically saying this is what we think will work best. So we're actually developing models to determine, is that the best course of action? Is there a better course of action to help reduce active shooters? And then, of course, my particular field, I'm looking at ways to reduce medical errors associated with point of distribution sites. So, talked about the Purdue Homeland Security Institute. We looked at the things we've done in the past, such as the Chicago catastrophic event scenario, Indianapolis Super Bowl scenario. We also looked at how we're using AnyLogic to improve active shooter mitigation and also point of distribution optimization, and then some of the things we're looking at in the future. I'm ready for any questions.
Thank you very much. So I graduated from Purdue, and I also teach at Virginia Tech, and having to be in the building next to the shooting. So I had to ask you these questions.
Okay.
I'm intrigued to see, during any shooting event, the behavior of the responders, fight or flight, how nervous they are. That is going to define a lot of the outcome that you might see. So did you model this behavior based on any data? Did you calibrate that behavior, or is it just a testing of different scenarios?
All of the data that we have, that we inputted into the model, came from, surprisingly, we didn't actually use the shooting incident that happened at Purdue back in 2012, mainly because that was not classified as an active shooter event, because it was one person going after a very specified target. That was actually considered a premeditated murder. So we did not use that data. But all the data we used for our models, to include response of the first responders, response of the participants, came from previous data, such as Sandy Hook, Columbine, things of that nature. Thank you, sir.